Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay. So I'm Vicky and I'm going to be producing the Lunch and Learn this month for you, where we're going to talk about loan working. Just to let you know that this session is recorded, and if we've got any questions, we've got the chat function that you can pop your questions in there and we'll look at discussing at the end of the session. So what is a lone worker? So we've probably all got different variations in the business that we may consider a lone worker. And that is an employee or a contractor who performs work alone without close or direct supervision. So we're going to have a look at some examples now of what might be considered a lone worker. So we've got facilities management and maintenance. Now that can be anything from the building engineer carrying out reactive maintenance, and they may be alone in a plant room outside of normal hours. Construction workers, and that can be construction where we've got contractors on site that are undertaking snagging or finishing work, either alone or on a partially occupied site. We've got healthcare settings, and that could be from a district nurse visiting patients in their homes without direct supervision. And security. Now that can be your night security guard monitoring a site or CCTV system on their own. Transport and logistics. And this refers to either delivery drivers completing routes independently throughout the day, or it may be that you've just got drivers within the organisation that travel all over the country, maybe in their own company, in a company vehicle or their own vehicles, but they will be considered a lone worker. Retail, so a shop worker working opening or closing premises alone, or managing a small store during quiet periods. Utilities and engineering, so where we've got field engineers that go out to site and attend breakdowns, and that may be a remote or an isolated location. Cleaning services, so a cleaner working early mornings or late evenings in an otherwise empty building. Agriculture, a farm worker that may be operating machinery or carrying out inspections in remote rural areas. And then we've got your office and remote workers, so a home worker that may be completing tasks without direct supervision or colleagues present, or you may have some people that are flexible workers that may come in before anybody else is within the building or leave later at night. So all those kind of industries and workers can be considered as lone working. So we've got some key risks on the next slide here. And we're just going to talk through each point a little bit. But this slide really highlights the core risk areas that can affect people working alone or in less supervised settings. And the aim is awareness and prevention, so not just about reacting when something goes wrong, but spotting the risk early and putting those controls into place. And very often the categories can overlap. So, for example, stress can increase the chance of accidents, and a medical emergency may become more serious if nobody is nearby. So when we look at accidents or injury, and this can cover everyday physical hazards such as your slips, trips and falls, manual handling, equipment use or environmental dangers. Now, if a lone worker is injured, there may be nobody available to assist or to raise that alarm promptly. So the key point is that even the routine tasks can become higher risk when somebody is working by themselves. And this is where we need to make sure that we've got those safe systems of work, your training and regular check-ins where appropriate. So, for example, we may have a maintenance engineer that falls from a ladder whilst they're working alone and can't call out for help. Or we can have a cleaner that are working outside of hours, may slip on a wet floor and the building may be empty, in which case they're going to remain undiscovered for a number of hours. So we've got violence and aggression. And this risk, it's particularly relevant in public-facing roles, people that may carry out home visits, enforcement work, or situations where people may be distressed or unpredictable. And the important message here is that the lone workers may be more exposed because that support is not immediately available. So we need to consider training such as conflict awareness, de-escalation, reporting procedures, and where staff should withdraw from a situation. And this could be where we might have a retail worker that's working late, they may be threatened during a robbery, or a delivery driver may be confronted in a remote or an unfamiliar location. So the medical emergencies, and this can relate to either a sudden illness or existing health conditions that may become urgent while somebody is alone. Now, sudden illness can become life-threatening without immediate support. And the concern is that response time can be delayed if nobody notices that there's a problem. So we need to make sure we've got emergency contacts are up to date, that escalation procedure is in place, we're carrying out our welfare checks and making sure that staff are actually aware of how to call for help quickly. Stress, fatigue and working hours. So this is often less visible but just as important because it can affect judgment, concentration and overall well-being. And the risk grows when workloads are high, shifts might be long, or workers are feeling isolated. So isolation can lead to stress and anxiety or reduced morale, which can affect your mental health as well. So lone workers may work irregular or extended hours without adequate breaks. Now, this can also be considered as both a well-being issue and a safety issue. So since tired or stressed staff are more likely to make mistakes. And this can also relate to a home-based worker that may experience loneliness and reduced engagement over time, or a lone night worker developing fatigue and stress due to lack of concentration and interaction. And also anxiety might creep in there as well, where we are working in high risk or isolated environments. So then we're going to look at the environmental and site-specific hazards. Now, there are certain environments where the increase in danger when working alone is higher. So thinking about working at height without supervision. So for example, if we're carrying out any roof work or inspections, and that exposure to hazardous substances with no support if exposure occurs. There may be remote locations, so working in rural sites, plant rooms or basements, and that may be where communication is poor. And lack of supervision and decision-making pressure. Now, the risk to that lone worker is they may need to make decisions without guidance, which potentially can increase the likelihood of errors. So, for example, it maybe we've got a junior member of staff that makes an unsafe decision when they're unsure of how to proceed, or a contractor continues work despite unsafe conditions due to lack of oversight. Communication failures. So the risk we've got here is that inability to contact the worker or vice versa, and the delays then with regards to the emergency responses. So we may have no mobile signal in a plant room or a remote site. There may be failure to check in at agreed intervals, and that might go unnoticed, or a faulty lone working device or alarm. And equipment or task-related risks. So certain tasks are inherently unsafe to carry out alone. So, for example, manual handling or heavy loads without assistance, confined space entry without standby personnel, or operating dangerous machinery solo. We do have those legal requirements as well for an employer. So obviously we must be considering the legal duties here, and we've just got some examples on this slide. I'm not going to go into too much on the legal side for you, but just to give you a little bit of an example on each point here. So where we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, so employers must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare of employees. Now, in the application to that lone worker, we must make sure that they're protected to the same standard as other employees. And we must consider any risk arising from working alone without support or supervision. So failing to provide adequate communication for a lone night worker could potentially breach this duty. Then we've got the management of health and safety at work regulations. And again, we're required here to carry out suitable and sufficient risk assessments and ensure employees are competent and establish emergency procedures. So as an employer, we need to identify any specific lone working risks, whether it's violence, medical emergencies or isolation. Implement the control measures, so your checking systems, again, is it supervision or do we need additional training? And ensure workers know what to do in an emergency situation. Workplace health, safety and welfare regulations, we need to ensure that workplaces are safe and suitable. So this can be down to your premises must remain safe for any individuals that are working alone. So have we got adequate lighting, access and egress and welfare facilities? But obviously there might be that special consideration for out of hours or isolated work. Now we've got PPE in here as well. And obviously the legal duty falls on that employer where we need to provide suitable PPE where risks can't be controlled otherwise. Now, lone workers, again, are going to be exposed to hazards, must have the appropriate PPE, but just remember that where we've got no supervision, we don't know 100% that PPE is being used in the correct way. So we need to make sure it is sufficient and it's reliable as well. And then we've got RIDDOR reporting here. So again, that legal duty there to report certain incidents to the HSE. So if we've got any incidents that have occurred to a lone worker, for example, it might be injuries that are actually after a delayed discovery, they may be reportable. So we've got to highlight here the importance of monitoring and those communication systems. Equality Act, so protecting employees from discrimination and ensure reasonable adjustments. So even with our lone workers, we've got to consider the arrangements with regards to disability, medical conditions and pregnancy as well. So our adjustments may include not permitting lone working in certain cases. And then we've got working time regulations. So again, we need to be looking at controlling working hours, adequate rest breaks and night work as well. So your lone workers, especially night workers, we don't want them exposed to either excessive hours and fatigue risks as well. So as an employer, we've got a duty of care for any of our lone workers. So I've got a few bullets on there for you to have a look at. But again, we must ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare of employees while at work. And as the duties that fall on that employer, we're looking at providing that safe system of work. So develop and implement safe procedures for all tasks and ensure lone working is risk assessed and controlled. And this can be including a checking system for lone workers that are attending site visits. Carrying out those risk assessments, so we're going to be identifying your hazards and assessing that risk, making sure lone working is included and implement suitable control measures. So this could be, for example, assessing risks of violence for staff that may be visiting external premises alone. Provide information, instruction, training and supervision. So we need to make sure that all of our employees understand risks and safe working practices. So supervision must be appropriate even for lone working. So we need to make sure we're still training staff on conflict management and emergency procedures, but don't forget the refresher training on those as well. Provide your safe PPE and equipment. So we still want to make sure equipment's suitable, maintained and safe to use, but providing our lone workers potentially with lone working devices, alarms or sufficient PPE for the field staff. Ensure that safe working environment as well, so maintaining safe premises. And it might be that we need to look at adequate lighting and security as well for out of hours workers. And it's really important that we've got an emergency procedure established, so clear arrangements for emergencies, including lone working as well, and having an escalation process in place if a lone worker fails to check in. And then monitor and review, so regularly reviewing those risk assessments and those control measures to make sure that they are working. So employers, we need to anticipate the risk and take proactive steps to prevent harm and not just respond after an incident occurs. So as well as the employer, employees as well have got their own duty of care. And again, we want to make sure that they are actively participating in maintaining safety and not relying solely upon the employer. So taking care of their own safety. So we're putting training in place and we're putting safe systems of work. The employee needs to make sure they follow the training, carry out the safe systems of work, and avoid any unnecessary risk. And a lone worker mustn't undertake tasks that they know are unsafe to perform. Cooperation with the employer, so following those policies and procedures and risk assessments that you've implemented, particularly for lone working. So that you'd expect them to comply by the lone worker checking in and going through those correct procedures that you as a business has put into place. Use the equipment properly, so using their PPE and equipment as instructed, carrying out their inspections and reporting faults. So we want to make sure that they are carrying and activating maybe a lone working alarm where required, depending on the level of risk that they're going to be exposed to. And then reporting hazards and concerns, so notifying the employer of any risks, incidents or unsafe conditions. We'll want to make sure that, if there is any aggressive behaviour, it's being reported if it's being encountered on sites. And not misuse any safety equipment. So anything that is provided, the employee must make sure that they don't interfere with anything that's been provided for their safety. Communication, we've got quite a few elements on here. Obviously, lone working communication comes up quite frequently as to how do we manage that communication with a lone worker. Quite a few examples just to have a quick look at on here. But effective lone working communication obviously requires that combination of a scheduled contact, reliable technology, and a clear escalation procedure to ensure that workers can raise the alarm and be supported in the event of an emergency. So having those scheduled check-ins, it may be that you've got a pre-agreed interval to confirm that they're safe. So, for example, a facilities engineer could call their manager every 2 hours whilst they are carrying out lone working. So best practice on this is define that frequency based on the risk level, make sure it's agreed, and include an escalation if a check-in is missed as well. There's lots of different lone working devices, a man-down system or panic alarm. So electronic devices that allow workers to raise an alarm or automatically trigger if no movement is detected. And this could be a device that somebody wears, so if they fall or they become immobile, it raises an alarm to either a third party or an external organisation. So as well, we've got your usual mobile phones and apps. A lot of people will use mobile phones, things like using WhatsApp groups, Teams groups, just to check in so we know that people have arrived. So it doesn't have to be really high tech as long as it works. But what we need to remember is where we've got field workers or people that are working in environments where their signals may not be very good. So, for example, in your basement areas, we need to make sure we've got suitable signal available. And if we are relying on that one mobile device, it might be worth having a second backup, so we're not relying on a single communication method that potentially they may go into an area that it won't work for them. So a buddy system, a designated person that monitors the lone worker's activities. So it could be you've got an office-based colleague that tracks the worker's schedule and expected return times, or a manager that's monitoring diary entries for site visits. But again, we want clear responsibility for that monitoring and that escalation procedure in place. Simple sign in and sign out system where workers log their presence and expected movements. Could be as simple as your contractor sign into a building and they record the expected finish time, or a lone worker logs an entry time into a plant room or a remote area, or a digital permit system tracking who is on site. Then we've got the GPS tracking and monitoring systems. So this can be like real-time tracking of worker locations. So maybe more so where you've got fleet vehicles. So fleet tracking for delivery drivers, or potentially monitoring engineers working in a remote or rural locations as well. But again, we need to be looking at using that proportionately and considering privacy, but that can be used combined with a check-in system as well. Radio communication, so a two-way radio for instant communication where mobile signal is poor. So this could be a security team that uses radios across a large site, or construction workers that communicate across different areas, or facility teams that are working in plant rooms or basements. But again, we need to make sure that that device covers all across the whole site. And if possible, assign a dedicated channel as well for that lone worker. And then we've got the emergency escalation procedure. So it's really important that we've got defined communication process if something does go wrong. So if a check-in is missed, obviously we'll be looking at attempting maybe phone contact, contacting an emergency contact, and that escalation to emergency services is required. But we need to clearly document it, train all our employees on it, and make sure we've actually got time-bound escalation steps so everybody knows at what point do we move on to the next step of that escalation. And then we've got pre-task and post-task communication. So that's communication before and after a high-risk activity. So, for example, a worker can inform their manager before entering a confined space or an isolated area, or just confirmation call after completing work at height or a hazardous task, logging start and finish times of their lone activities. So it doesn't have to be really complicated, it doesn't have to be really expensive, as long as it's going to work for that level of risk that they're exposed to. So emergency procedures that I just want to reiterate on this is that basically this kind of sets out that basic response in an emergency. So the priority is always going to be that safety first, to protect yourself and others before taking further action. So we want to make sure that we can act quickly and raise the alarm using the right emergency contact or reporting route, following that correct procedure for the situation rather than guessing or improvising, and keep communication clear and brief so that the right people know what is happening. After there may be an incident, make sure it is reported and reviewed so that lessons can be learned from that. So the main takeaway is simple: to stay calm, act fast, and follow that procedure. And just a few personal tips on there, as we just said: stay alert, avoid risk, and trust your instincts. If you think something feels wrong, doesn't feel safe, you need to be communicating anything back to the manager as a lone worker where you feel you may be either put into danger or working in an area that you do not feel safe in. And that incident reporting, so we've just very briefly mentioned there, all incidents, even for lone workers, should still be reported. If we don't investigate these, we can't learn from them and also look at improving safety in the future. It might be something really simple that you are actually acknowledging that your check-in systems are not working. So irregular check-ins, it may be that somebody needs an alarm set for every couple of hours to check in. So it might not actually be an accident, but it's actually if that procedure isn't working, I'd be looking at that as an incident, as to that check-in system didn't work. How can we learn from it, and what can we put in place to make sure it does work for us in the future? So just to wrap up on here, just remember those risks do exist. Planning reduces danger, but safety is also shared between the employer and the employee. Okay, brilliant. Obviously, if anything does come up in the meantime, or you come off the webinar and something triggers a thought, by all means, just drop an email over and we can reply to you separately. But thank you very much and appreciate your time, everybody.